Ramiro, we're ready to get started.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Nice to see you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ramiro Álvarez Ugarte. I'm a researcher at the Center for Study on Freedom of Expression at the University of Palermo in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I'm here today to moderate this workshop in the context of the Law of Freedom of Expression project at Columbia University. Let me first start with a brief description of the context in which this workshop takes place. Last year, the Law of Freedom of Expression project launched an initiative to expand its database of case law on violence against journalists, under the idea that to find and to figure out what judges around the world are doing regarding this problem, which some courts has described as the most extreme form of censorship, was important. So we sought to understand and to find those cases of murder, of journalists, of aggression, of harassment. We also included in our working definition of violence against journalists cases of online harassment and surveillance, especially online harassment of women journalists, and surveillance in the sense that it might be something that precedes violence against journalists. We divided the world in regions, and we worked with regional researchers. We found around 17 new cases from the last 5 years that we haven't included in the database already. And we managed to identify and summarize 43 new decisions. We'll share some of those insights, especially as related to Europe today. We will discuss international human rights standards on violence against journalists. Let me tell you who joined us today. So Tarlac McGonigal is the professor of media law and information society at the Leiden Law School of the University of Amsterdam. Tarlac has been our main researcher, and he will be in Europe, and he will be our first speaker. And then we are joined by Renette Schroeder, the director of the European Federation of Journalists, Sarah Clark, who is the head of Europe and Asia at Article 19, and Julia Ukese, secretary to the MSI SLP group at the Council of Europe. Without further ado, Tarlac, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. Let me start by saying that I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it has been a real pleasure to work with you and your team over the past period in contributing in a modest way to this important work that you are doing. Before I start my presentation in earnest, I'd just like to have a big shout out to the excellent research team that worked on this with me. Anouk Backhaus, Arletta Meiring, Mariah Reisebrei, and Christina Chendic. They did really great work in identifying and summarizing the cases, and I hope all of you watching will have the benefit of that now that they're in the database. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and then I will take it away. So I don't get scared by the number of slides. That's par for the course, and we can speed up as we need to. So just one moment, and we'll get going. Slideshow from the beginning. That's always a good place to start. So if this screen is nice and visible, I'll just get going. So I've been asked to take quite an educational approach, and I'm happy to do so. So some of it may be a little bit basic, but hopefully that will ensure that it's accessible to everybody. What I'd like to do today is start off by talking up the importance of case law as a catalyst for change. Other colleagues here today, like Renata and Sarah and their organizations, and their colleagues from other organizations, are doing fantastic mapping work when it comes to violations and threats to the freedom and safety of journalists and other media actors. But I think there's very important mapping work to be done when it comes to case law as well. And I'm very pleased that Colombia is playing a leading role in that. So what I'd like to explore is how case law can be used as a catalyst for change. And one way that I'll try to demonstrate that is to show how case law has been a driver of the political standard setting by the Council of Europe. And Julia will talk us through some specific aspects of this later in the panel. Then I would like to just pause and reflect on the different political recommendations that are there at the moment, that already exist and that are geared towards enhancing the protection and safety of journalists and other media actors. I'll look briefly at 3 Council of Europe recommendations, and then 3 European level recommendations. And then I'll have the big question, where do we go from here? Okay, so nice symmetry with all these 3s. Council of Europe. I have to get used to saying that it's now 46 member states and not 47. As I say, Julia will give us a more comprehensive overview later, but I would just like to start by standing back from the precise instruments that the Council of Europe uses to protect human rights generally and the freedom and safety of journalists in particular. So the Council of Europe really has been the leader of human rights protection in Europe. It's the primary regional organization, intergovernmental organization dealing with these issues. And it is helped and driven by the European Convention on Human Rights as really the cornerstone of legal protection for human rights in Europe. The European Union also has a complementary system, but that is more recent in its explicit focus on human rights. So I'm going to focus on the Council of Europe for now. So what's important to realize is that the legal protection offered by the European Convention on Human Rights is really important, but it's not enough. And if you talk to experts, they will repeatedly tell you that we've got lots of carefully worded standards that offer protection for journalists, but there's still an implementation gap. And that implementation gap flows from sometimes a lack of political will and sometimes a lack of practical mechanisms to enforce the rights guaranteed at the legal level. So we have to realize that although legal protection frameworks are crucially important, they're not enough on their own. And that's what this slide tries to do. It tries to show that there in one corner, you've got the big, bold principles of freedom of expression, very high-minded and idealistic. And they have to be captured and articulated in the convention, the European Convention on Human Rights. But the convention deals with a whole range of rights. So each right is guaranteed in quite short texts, short articles. So that's important, but it's not enough. The case law of the European Court of Human Rights then brings these important principles and rights to life by exploring what their implications are in the specific context of individual cases, right? And this is where the catalyst for change starts. But the court is obliged to focus on the facts of a given case and not to be a policymaker. Okay, so that's where another body of the Council of Europe steps in, the Committee of Ministers, and it is concerned with political standard setting, and it takes the case law of the court as its starting point and develops the case law into more operational measures. And all of this ensures that the right to freedom of expression is meaningful and effective in practice, not just a paper tiger, but something with teeth. So here in summary is the European Convention on Human Rights is the central reference point, but other bodies of the Council of Europe further ensure that the rights enshrined in the convention are brought to life. The rights have to be practical and effective. Quick overview of the different bodies within the Council of Europe that are active and strongly active in protecting freedom of expression, including the rights of journalists. Just for a dab of color, Julia will give more details later. It's important, before we start talking about the really important public watchdog role played by journalists and other media actors in democratic societies, that these, their role as critics of power, and by providing information and opinions that are crucial to public debate, before they can perform those all-important tasks, they have to enjoy basic freedoms. Otherwise, their rights to freedom of expression are meaningless. So it's important to look at other articles and rights guaranteed by the Convention: the right to life, prohibition of torture, right to liberty and security, and all these other rights here. So important to take a holistic approach. And I think that's one of the key focuses of the mapping exercise by Global Freedom of Expression, to look not just at the free expression rights, but how those free expression rights are dependent on the prior safeguards for a whole range of other rights, and in particular, the right to life and safety. So, few principles from the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. Freedom of expression is crucial for democratic society. In order for freedom of expression to be meaningful, there has to be an enabling environment for those using their freedom of expression. And obviously and essentially, that involves full safety and protection for everyone. Safety, security, and protection. And only when those guarantees are in place can everyone contribute to public debate, and there shouldn't be any chilling effects on freedom of expression. So here are a few interpretive principles. I've more or less mentioned them. The additional one I'd like to mention is that the convention has to be a living instrument. It has to take account of new realities, such as the digital dimension to freedom of expression, how threats and intimidation and harassment of journalists can come through digital technologies. So it has to be aware of these new threats to freedom of expression. And states have a range of obligations, both negative, not to interfere with the right to life of individuals or the right to freedom of expression of individuals, but also more far-reaching positive obligations to take the necessary measures to ensure that these rights are protected in practice. And that's really, really important when it comes to ensuring the safety and protection of journalists and other media actors. The most far-reaching statement of the state's relevant positive obligations comes in the Dink and Turkey judgment. Look at this text carefully, because it really does frame all of the standard setting that I will be talking about in a few minutes. States are obliged to, that's hard language, obliged to. It's not they should, maybe, consider. They are obliged to put in place an effective system of protection for authors and journalists as part of their broader obligation to create a favorable environment for participation in public debate by everyone, and to enable the expression of opinions and ideas without fear, even when they are contrary to those held by the authorities or by a significant section of public opinion, and even if they are annoying or shocking for the latter. Very, very important principle, because it links safety and security issues and protection issues to the actual exercise of freedom of expression. And note the inclusion of the words "without fear." Very, very important, because one of the typical tactics to threaten and intimidate journalists and other media actors is to try to instill a sense of fear in them, to create a chilling effect that will try to pressurize them into being less active in their reporting, less rigorous, less of a public watchdog, if you like. And that's a problem not only for the journalists in question, but for society at large. It's a problem for all of us, and it's important to see it in those terms. Bear this in mind. It's going to be really important in the next slides. So the chilling effect can come from a whole range of sources. It can come from physical aggression. It can come from verbal aggression. It can come from threats, violence, murders. But it can come from misuse and abuse of legislation, and it can come from a whole range of sources. So it's important to see things in broad terms, look at the whole environment, and be aware of the different types of pressures and threats that can cause a chilling effect. Right, so now we're on to the Committee of Ministers recommendation 216.4 on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists and other media actors. This is really central, and that's why I'm going to spend quite some time unpacking it. Most important thing about this recommendation is that it tries to punch very firmly. It tries to really get states to step up to that implementation gap that I mentioned and really raise their game when it comes to protecting journalists in all kinds of practical ways. So there were a number of reasons for drafting it: to end the continuing violence, threats, and intimidation targeting journalists, to effectively address gender-specific aspects. At the time when this was adopted by the Committee of Ministers, there had been rather little attention for the all-important gender-specific dimension to threats and violence and aggression, targeting female journalists in particular, and the so-called double burden of being attacked, not just for your critical reporting as a journalist, but also for sexist reasons, namely that you were a woman. And this is a particularly pressing problem online. So the recommendation seeks to acknowledge that and address it. To eradicate impunity for perpetrators of crimes against journalists, because this is still a scourge of European society, that in some countries there are examples of crimes being committed against journalists, whether they are violent attacks or, in worst cases, actual killings of journalists, and for a concatenation of reasons, sometimes a lack of political will, but sometimes a lack of resources, that those responsible for crimes against journalists haven't been prosecuted or convicted. And we're not just talking about the attackers and the murderers, but also the masterminds of these crimes. And there's a whole chain of complicity involved in such crimes. To ensure a favorable environment for free expression, to clarify the practical implications of states' positive obligations, because very often these positive obligations are formulated in general terms and they need to be operationalized, and to take into account the evolving nature of public debate and devise far-reaching strategies and measures to yield viable solutions. So a few features of this recommendation, again, as part of the effort to get states to take their commitments more seriously, it was a call on states to review and revise national laws and practice to ensure compliance with the convention. We'll get back to that later because it's a very important step to make states actually take measures, document those measures, and think critically about those measures and their effectiveness. Systematic attention for gender-specific aspects, a similar attention for the digital dimension, a comprehensive and coherent approach, again, so we can look at all the threats. And this is really important for today's presentation, firm and explicit grounding in the principles developed by the European Court of Human Rights. Here you can really see the principles of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights being a catalyst for change. Also because, this recommendation was ambitious, is ambitious, and some states may object to how far-reaching some of the provisions may be. In that light, it's very important to ground everything as transparently and firmly as possible in the actual case law of the court. And when you use the case law of the court skillfully in this way, you have a firm legal basis for the political measures that you're trying to advance. So I think a very important strategy used here, and also a useful collection of the relevant principles. And also to look at how different branches of the state can be implicated and what they can do to improve things. Okay, just to reassure you, Ramiro, I am watching a stopwatch as I speak, so I will keep a close eye on that. The recommendation is structured as follows, and there are 4 pillars to the substantive guidelines: prevention, protection, prosecution, with a general focus and a specific focus on impunity, and the promotion of information, education, and awareness raising. This is a lot of text. Let me see, I'll pick something out. comprehensiveness is really important, to look at the state's look at all aspects of the state's legislative frameworks, and to get a clear overview of which provisions are relevant for the protection of journalists, and to really look at them critically and ideally review them and update them and make them more effective for giving protection to journalists and eliminating hidden threats to journalists, such as old statute laws, maybe 100 years old. It does happen. 100 years old, which can suddenly be invoked in an internet context for spurious reasons and have a chilling effect on freedom of expression. So important also to look at how laws such as anti-terrorism, anti-extremism and national security laws can impact on journalists' freedom and also their safety. And important to keep these national review mechanisms under independent review. So it's a serious exercise, not just box ticking. That's prevention. Protection is pillar 2. And here, the recommendation really tries to tease out the practical implications of positive state obligations when it comes to offering protection. When it comes to, these are very obvious ways that can be of practical support to journalists, and you see them being developed at the national level in different countries: hotlines, emergency contact points, and a big shout out to the NGOs present today as well, whom with their colleagues from other organizations are doing really fantastic support work for journalists and other media actors in this regard. And the coalitions they have built are really more than the sum of their parts. But also educating all state authorities about how they, within their responsibilities, could improve how the protection given to journalists. And we see nice examples in the Netherlands and elsewhere of initiatives involving different stakeholders, including governmental bodies, collectively coming up with action plans and measures to enhance the protection of journalists. The prosecution pillar sets out specific rules and procedures for ensuring that the effective investigation and prosecution of crimes against journalists. Here, the recommendation is really solidly based on the case law of the court, and the court, in its judicial wisdom, sometimes formulates principles in a cryptic or complicated way. So what this section of the recommendation tries to do is to tease out what these recommendations mean in practice. How do you ensure that the journalists themselves or their families or next of kin are actively involved in investigations, that they receive enough information? How do you ensure, what procedural measures do you need to ensure that when there is a suspicion of an attack being linked to the journalistic activities of the victim, that is systematically and rigorously investigated? This is where the recommendation really comes into its own and has added value. And it can never be an excuse for the state to say that they don't have the resources to follow up properly. It can never be an excuse for the state to say that they don't have the resources to provide effective protection in individual cases when they're aware of it. It is their positive obligation to do so. And there again, you see the case law being translated into the recommendation. The court does, however, acknowledge that while states cannot use a lack of resources as an excuse not to take action, it can be a relevant consideration when determining exactly what measures are taken. So it is a little bit nuanced, but nevertheless an important principle. And then the final pillar is mainly about promoting information, education, and awareness raising, all very important for ensuring a favorable environment for safety. We see in various countries that, for example, critical independent journalists and public service media are being targeted aggressively and erroneously as being fake news media. And this contributes to a hostile environment in which it is somehow perversely accepted by some small groups in society to be aggressive. And so information, media literacy, very important. Now I am conscious of time. I'm going to really speed up. What's very interesting is to see that this recommendation has been informed by key case law of the court, which is included in Colombia's database. But this recommendation has also impacted on the court's subsequent case law. And here are a few cases in which the court cited the recommendation as a relevant source. And in some cases, certainly the latter three mentioned here, Mazepa and others, Kadija Ismailova and Shurovic in Hungary, the court used new elements in the recommendation to strengthen and advance its own case law. And one example was the what I mentioned a moment ago about the need to investigate whether there is a link to the pursuit of journalistic activities. That should be part and parcel of any effective investigation into attacks or violence against journalists. So I'll skip over the exact facts. An infographic that I'm very proud of, but it doesn't add anything to this presentation. Julia will tell us more about the implementation strategy, I'm sure. Various bodies have made calls to implement this recommendation. Here we get back to the implementation gap. We need the political will, the political follow-up to implement the key provisions of the recommendation. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has called for this, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the OSCE. Very, very important to keep the momentum going and make this come alive in practice. Right, I've got 1.5 minutes. The trilogy of the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers recommendations. So I'd like to draw your attention to 3 complementary recommendations which were developed successively. You can see it in the dates there, 216, 218, and 222 last week, actually, 17th of March. And even though they were developed one after the other, if we look back at them, we will see that they are actually very, very complementary. And they go a long way to addressing different aspects of this enabling environment for freedom of expression. The first one, which I've spent so much time talking about, safety and protection. Without the safety and protection, you cannot move on to effective freedom of expression and information. The next one is about some environmental issues, the media pluralism and transparency of media ownership. And the third one is about promoting a favorable environment for quality journalism in the digital age, and looks at the conditions that are necessary for quality journalism to thrive, including financial support and work conditions and a whole range of other pressures, which are relevant and are often overlooked in legal and political documents. I won't steal Julia's thunder. She'll tell us what's in the magic hat that's going to be pulled out at the Council of Europe in the coming period in terms of new recommendations. But before we go any further, and this is bringing me back to the more regional system of protection for freedom of expression, it's not just the Council of Europe that is active in this field. It is the Council of Europe is playing a leading role, but the OSCE in general, but in particular, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media is doing really, really important work, has been doing so for years. And that's a very important institutional player. I'd like to mention in particular the OSCE Ministerial Council Decision number 318 on safety of journalists. Very significant document in OSCE terms, because such ministerial council decisions have to be achieved by full consensus. And there was a very frustrating period in which it wasn't possible to achieve that consensus. This was a breakthrough document for them. It covers a lot of the same ground as the Committee of Ministers recommendation, but it takes a firm stance on things like the importance of national data collection about violence against journalists, the relevance of arbitrary interference with journalists through surveillance and encryption, journalists' use of encryption techniques. also the calls for outright condemnation of attacks on journalists, especially on female journalists, and also the a very important call for the unconditional release of journalists who have been arbitrarily detained or arrested. And finally, the European Commission's recent recommendation on ensuring protection, safety, empowerment of journalists and other media professionals again covers a lot of the same ground, but it does focus on 3 sets of specific recommendations: the protection and safety of journalists during protests and demonstrations, ensuring online safety and digital empowerment, and empowering and protecting female journalists and those belonging to minority groups or reporting on equality. Important focuses, and it also requires member states of the European Union to report within 18 months, and it envisages some monitoring activities. I'll leave it at that with the final message of warning or encouragement, depending on who you are and what you are doing. These are important political recommendations. They are sometimes criticized for not going far enough and not having enforcement machinery. That's often the case with political documents, but they can provide a very valuable basis for legal instruments, and legal instruments that are accompanied by effective monitoring and enforcement measures. We've been in a moment of opportunity for a long time now, and I think this is coming to a head within the EU with an EU Media Freedom Act is being prepared at the moment, and this is a once-off, a unique opportunity to translate all of these efforts in political documents and in case law into something that is really, really meaningful for a longer period of time ahead. It's a unique opportunity. I hope it will be seized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarek. That was great. As a Latin American, I should say that Europe and the European system of human rights has been a source of inspiration for our national and regional courts. And while the Inter-American Court has done a lot with regard to this issue, it has taken the main points from the European Court. So that was great. Thank you very much. Renate Schroeder is the director of the European Federation of Journalists. Renate, you have the floor.
Renate, thank you. Actually, Renata, like Latin American, would be easier. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tala, for this very extensive outline. I think every politician should, as an introduction, listen to that and understand what it means to protect journalists and to have a positive obligation, because it seems that there is neither the political will, I talk about that, but or people have forgotten or don't know about that. You're completely right in addressing also the importance of a holistic approach. I think I will refer to that a little bit in some comments I will give you in a few moments. So first of all, I would also like to thank the Global Freedom of Expression Program of Columbia University to organize these workshops and focusing today on Europe, which, yes, is still an example for many others, but unfortunately doesn't seem to go in the right direction. Just a few words on the European Federation of Journalists. We are a federation of journalist unions and associations in all Council of Europe member states, plus Belarus. And I have to say now, plus Russia. We have a very small independent union, mostly from St. Petersburg and Moscow in Russia as well. Our affiliates defend at national and regional level journalists, be they freelance or staff, in all media on and offline. Yesterday, I chaired a panel on the safety of journalists with journalists from Greece and France, the union representative from Germany, and the president of the police union. The central question was, how do we move towards a Europe where the realization of the right to protest and the safety of journalists go hand in hand? And this in times of increased social unrests, new forms of extremism, and lack of trust in both media and democratic institutions, pandemics, and now even a horrible war in the midst of Europe. The EFJ is part of the group, and thanks Talar again for applauding our work there in Article 19 as well, that monitors all kinds of attacks against journalists and media. On the one hand, at EU level, through this so-called media freedom rapid response mechanism, but also, and I thought Tom Gibson from the Committee to Direct Journalism would talk more about it, from the Council of Europe platform on the protection of journalism and safety of journalists. This is a lot of work because unfortunately it's more and more. We are very small offices, but it's very important for us. Specifically the latter, the Council of Europe platform, is important because it allows to have a dialogue. When we put an alert, which is verified by the Council of Europe, the governments are asked to respond to that. And they do not respond always, but quite a few of the member states still feel it as a affront. They want to show that they are the good boys. They do respond. Few cases we also come to a resolution, to a way out. Of course, not always. The usual suspects don't respond, and I won't name them here. 2021 was marked, as the previous year before, by the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the EU, 34.2% of alerts were linked to COVID-19. Many media freedom violations took place at protests and demonstrations, many held by anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown groups. Journalists covering protests find themselves indeed embedded between a small but loud, aggressive group of protesters and police, not always there to protect journalists, sometimes even being aggressive themselves to them. And all that in many countries where politicians, and Talar said that as well, lead smear campaigns more and more against journalists. We call it the sort of Trump effect, and thereby almost justifying the behavior of these crowds. We had, and I'm coming back to the panel, testimonies from Greece and France. There was a woman field reporter from France giving us a very moving testimony about the aggression, the violence, the verbal and physical harassment she was facing, and partly, or maybe mainly, because she is a woman. It was said online harassment is actually, and that's also in the report you gave, as Ramiro mentioned it, it's a violation against journalists, and it's on the rise. So the right to know is endangered, especially from reporting from demonstrations, or as we now from the war. Just to remind all of us, 6 journalists have lost their life, and this only after 3 weeks of this horrible war in the Ukraine. With regard to your question on main challenges regarding violence against journalists, let me give you a few thoughts. I have 6. The first one is, of course, we need to fight the root causes of this unprecedented violence, which has increased partly due to the pandemic and the rising conspiracy and disinformation. But also at the roots, I think, of this are the increased polarization, the alienation of many sections of our societies, who feel excluded, both economically, but also socially. They are frustrated and see the media too close to the institutions. They do not trust. So one objective we are working on is to recreate trust in journalism by engaging more with audiences, by having more female and diverse newsrooms, but also by being less biased, more human, by going out more into the communities. That's something that is missing at the moment, not only, but mainly because we face a market failure in journalism. We have news deserts at local levels. So how can we do all this work? And I'm grateful you are mentioning the Council of Europe recommendation on quality of journalists. Actually, it was already finished in 2019. I wasn't a member there, but because of Russia, it's only been adopted now. But in that recommendation, there are very important issues partly also regarding media viability and the importance of supporting independent journalists. Second, we know that with the increase of populist and autocratic leaders who do smear campaigns against journalists and call them liars, the general atmosphere is becoming more toxic. Politicians do either lip servicing or are openly against journalists. They don't like critical media, let's face it. We need, therefore, more and more allies in civil society. We need more media literacy. We need an appreciation what amazing work journalists are doing and why the right to know is so important for our democracies. We need kids to be convinced and adults to be ready to pay. But we also need management to take the duty of care very seriously. We again have that now during the war, where a lot of media is sending freelancers, young and not protected, into the war, and we think this is not responsible. 3, while we can confirm that at international level, and we have just seen it, there is indeed a lot of support, a lot of resolutions, commitments, and thanks Ramiro for the excellent work you have done. At national level, this is rarely implemented. The European Commission lately has done a lot to support independent journalism. They started late, but they suddenly realized how important it is. And it adopted a recommendation on the safety of journalists, which was mentioned as well, very much relying on the Council of Europe work. It is excellent, but it lacks teeth because it's soft law. It's only a recommendation. Member states now have 18 months to implement it. But I can assure you, our members will look very closely at what governments are doing or not doing and will remind them of this. We already had our Croatian union and association having preliminary talk with the government, telling them about this and telling them how important that is. And in quite a few member states, EU law is still very important. So I think there we hope to get some good practice. In terms of good practice, because this is soft law, this is something international law doesn't give us, but it's coming out of international law. Let's give me one example. Our Dutch colleagues have done some best practice by creating the Perspect, Salah can pronounce it better, which is a safe hotline where journalists can report when they are confronted with aggression and violence. It is a hotline, but it's also a help desk. It offers training courses for journalists to help them become more resilient towards physical aggression when they have to deal with people on the street, but also online. How high is your visibility online? How can you make yourself more resilient as a journalist online? How can you face the online harassment? In just 1 year, Perspect registered 120 reports from journalists who had dealt with aggression and violence. Unfortunately, besides this indeed very good practice, the number of violence against journalists, not least the death of the crime reporter last year in the Netherlands, has decreased a little bit, but not enough. In Germany, our members, together with Reporters Without Borders, have recently launched a protection codex, asking the employers to take the duty of care seriously, also on behalf of freelancers. So far, there are about 6 media, both from broadcasting and print, who have signed this. We need more of that, but we also need more protection codexes in other countries. 5, the cooperation with the police needs to be improved. We need more dialogue between both groups. Both work under increasingly difficult circumstances, lacking training and enough staff. They have to understand each other's role and not be fed by stereotypes on both sides. This actually came out of the discussion with the police yesterday. And of course, the police needs to get the right orders from above that include the importance of protecting journalists at demonstration and not giving them, for example, just a small safe spot at the outside of the demonstration. The implementation, to come to the end, is the problem. The courts are not independent enough in many countries. but also in those where they are, it is a long, costly, and very tedious to resort to the courts. And for journalists, specifically freelancers, it is impossible. We have had some cases where the unions also took part in a class action, sometimes management, but it is not the solution. The positive duty of states to protect journalists is therefore hardly implemented. So let me finish by saying two things. Unless we repair the market failure in journalism and the ever more precarious status of journalists, not only leading in many countries to more self-censorship, but also to a worrying brain drain, to an unprecedented vulnerability and decrease in the quality of editorial work. In fact, we have many studies where specifically women journalists leave the profession. And unless we cannot convince governments to have the political will to regard protection of governments, of journalists, the support of independent journalism, indeed to see it as a cornerstone of the rule of law and of democracy, it will be difficult to protect journalism. It will be difficult to protect the right to know, and in the end, democracy. That's why we need all to act and work on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. That was very interesting and important. I would like to highlight two things that you mentioned that I think are especially pressing, which is the question of polarization and how it causes and increases violence, and the importance of the independence and access to courts, which is a challenge, of course, in many countries. Sarah Clark is the head of Europe and Asia at Article 19. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ramiro, and thank you to you and your colleagues for organizing this really important event. I wanted to focus my remarks on some of the innovations that we're looking at in terms of justice, particularly as it relates to journalists who've been killed in Europe. But just by way of background, Article 19 is a global free expression organization, and we work in all regions and work through the courts and the international bodies to advance standards on freedom of expression. So obviously the case law of Strasbourg is really central to all of our work, and we spend a huge amount of time doing third-party interventions at the court, and also following up on the implementation of decisions through what are called Rule 9 submissions and advocacy. And one kind of important development on that area recently has been in the case of Turkey. So Turkey has, as you know, a long and terrible history of detaining journalists and activists for speech-related offences. And two of the really crucial cases that have emerged since the attempted coup of 2016 and the subsequent crackdown are that of Osman Kavala, the philanthropist, and Selahattin Demirtas, who's the head of the Kurdish political party. And in both cases, so neither are journalists, but these are very clear Article 10 cases. And in fact, both cases led to findings of violations of Article 18, which is the abuse of law, the kind of nuclear option in the court's arsenal. And yet in both cases, neither of the defendants have been released, despite continual pressure from the court and from the Council of Europe. And in the case of Osman Kavala, we've recently seen the Committee of Ministers who oversees the implementation of these decisions take their most decisive step with Turkey, and that's to launch infringement proceedings. So these are it's an unprecedented area of political pressure to enforce a European court ruling. And it's uncharted territory that we're in. It's unclear how Turkey is going to respond. But I think, sometimes we can forget the huge political significance of decisions from Strasbourg, and just how important it is to continue the pressure, when it comes to these cases. And then obviously these cases have widespread implications for journalists and others in detention around the Council of Europe region. It's really unfortunate now that we're in a situation where Russian citizens are left without recourse to the court 6 months from now. Again, an unprecedented moment, but that word has become so redundant recently. It's hard to know what's next, but I just know from working for many years with media lawyers in Russia, this is a really devastating blow to them, because for so long they have not been able to use the completely captured court system in Russia. And Strasbourg has been their only recourse. So a whole program actually of our work has been strategic litigation on cases in Russia, Article 10 or freedom of expression cases in Russia, and now unfortunately we see a situation where Russian citizens will no longer be able to go to Strasbourg. What I would say though is one of the last decisions from the court on Russia, a recent decision on OOO, has importantly referenced the issue of slaps, which is an area that we've been working on, and actually where it's been the work in the US and in Latin America that concept of slaps has really been developed. In Europe, I think we've been slower to recognize that this concept exists, and as far as we know, that's the first reference by Strasbourg to the issue of slaps, and that fits quite nicely into, I hope, what Julia will talk about, which is a recommendation that the Council of Europe is now going to work on with a number of experts on the issue of slaps. So you can see the importance of the court, obviously, in advancing these standards, and we really hope that it will continue, to be very ambitious in the scope of what they're prepared to rule on. But I wanted to talk about where sometimes we've seen, from, as you've heard from the previous presentations, is we've seen, the real difficulty, this implementation gap, in particular as it relates to impunity. And I wanted to discuss just for a little period a case that we've seen as sort of potentially quite groundbreaking. And that's the case of the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia and the establishment of what's called a public inquiry into her assassination. For those of you who don't know, Daphne was Malta's leading investigative journalist. She exposed massive corruption at the highest level of government. And she faced a huge number of threats, legal and physical, throughout her life or throughout her career. And unfortunately, she was blown up by car bomb in Malta in 2017. And on the, as soon as Daphne had been killed, there emerged a call for a public inquiry. It was first called for by the UN Special Rapporteurs, by 4 UN Special Rapporteurs, and then in the advice provided to the family by international barristers in London. And basically, a public inquiry is based on Article 2 of the European Convention on the Right to Life and the state's responsibilities to protect. And what immediately became clear was the huge political conflict in the investigation into her killing. From the get-go, you had a situation where judges she had been investigating were put in charge of the criminal case, where it was clear that there was absolutely massive political resistance to investigations into the killing. So you had a criminal case which was launched, on the day of her killing, and thankfully the FBI were in Malta when she was killed, and they lent their assistance to the criminal case. And in many ways, that the information that they had gathered led to the arrests of the hitmen. But what became, very clear, and I think we can see this in murders, globally, is journalists aren't killed in a vacuum, and the context, especially where they are killed for their investigations, is obviously critical, and we have a lot of case law on this, that link between the journalists and their investigation must be made clear. But it was so obvious that there was a huge amount of obfuscation and a very concerted PR attempt by the government to decouple Daphne's killing from her investigation, which was into the Prime Minister, his Chief of Staff, his ministers. And so the call for a public inquiry to investigate the context in which Daphne was killed and whether the state failed to protect her became really the rallying and central call of all free expression organizations. And for 2 years, the family of Daphne worked every possible mechanism in Europe, and in particular at the Council of Europe, because it's at the Council of Europe where you have the political side at the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe, who can call and pressure states to do this. And there had been a previous inquiry when the Russian politician Boris Nemtsov had been assassinated. So it was sort of based on this preceding example. And so the family, with the help of Special Representative Peter Omzicht, Special Rapporteur, who was at that Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe, pushed for 2 years to the point where there was a resolution ordering the establishment of this inquiry 3 months later. The government again did everything possible to resist. It tried to pack the inquiry with its own nominees. But finally, the family's resistance and their negotiations led to the establishment of a 3-person public inquiry. And Article 19 and the Daphne Foundation, which is the foundation that her family set up to combat corruption and to promote freedom of expression in Malta, we're currently studying this model to see how it could be used in other ECHR jurisdictions, because we see it. So ultimately, I'll just sort of very briefly explain what happened, but in the course of a year and a half, the inquiry held public hearings, including the questioning of the top level politicians in the country. It was the first time that any minister or the Prime Minister in open court was questioned and had to answer. They were compelled to appear in court and to answer the questions. And it was an extremely important process where essentially the inquiry and in their publication in July of last year really outlined the massive network of corruption that Daphne had been exposing. And it put a huge amount of information into the public domain about the threats that Daphne had been experiencing and the investigations she had been pursuing, which heretofore had never been in the public domain. And in many ways, it was a kind of a public process of grieving and of justice. And the public inquiry ultimately held the state responsible for her murder. Now, obviously, it's not a criminal proceeding, and those criminal proceedings are ongoing. So we've had a 2-track mechanism here, or 2 separate processes ongoing. But what we've really learned, I think, what many organizations or many people who've been following this would say, this is one of the most successful campaigns we've seen in terms of addressing impunity for the murder of journalists. I think simply because we had such a clear focus to the campaign, and that this the triggering of so many mechanisms is something that we now want to have sort of a roadmap of what other cases should look like. Now, a public inquiry isn't necessarily the right mechanism for every country or every jurisdiction. It's a peculiarly common law type of mechanism. So kind of originated in the UK, and Malta was a colony, so it has that common law approach. But what we're wondering is whether let's say in the cases in the Netherlands, in Greece, in Slovakia, in Northern Ireland, we have 26 cases of impunity for the killings of journalists, and many of those are highly political cases where there has been major reluctance by the state to prosecute or to investigate or to be exposed, and so that's really kind of what we've been looking at. Now, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the public inquiry, we've seen a lot of resistance from the government in implementing the recommendations. So there's still a chance that this case may well go to Strasbourg even after all of this has happened. We haven't had a conviction or convictions in the cases. In fact, it's just dragged on quite inordinately, and there are very real fears for the way in which the lawyers of the accused have been manipulating various they've used kind of every trope that might end in a mistrial. So there are a lot of concerns still, but I just wanted to say, I think when we look at the case law of the court has been really critical in the way in which the inquiry was conducted, and that there are these sort of new and evolving mechanisms. This is very living, a developing area. And we hope that we can look at how this could be done in other countries. So I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you for bringing up Daphne's case in Malta. Giulia Lucchese is the secretary to the Committee of Experts on Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation of the Council of Europe. Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramiro. I have a little of a sore throat, so I hope I don't have to unmute myself for a second for coughing, but I'll start my presentation by thanking you for inviting me to this very interesting and important exchange. Well, safety of journalists is a subject that is very dear to the organization I work for, which is the Council of Europe, and it is high in the agenda of its 46 member states. Now, I have a hard time in saying something still striking and interesting after all the excellent speakers before me, but we'll see. I'll do my best. I will start by saying that I read your draft inquiry, and I found it very informative in the way in which it takes a worldwide approach through the lenses of different courts' case law. Start my video. Can you see me now? I had a pop-up window. Okay, I guess you can. So today the focus is in Europe, on Europe, and still the opening statement in your outline correctly points out at what violence against journalists equals to everywhere it occurs, which is the most extreme form of censorship. Reading this statement immediately opens the door to some preliminary fundamental considerations. So information is crucial to the effective functioning of democracy, but also violence against journalists has at least a double dimension, as it not only targets those who impart the information, but also, and surely, those who have the right to receive those information. Now, this concept is very clearly stated in the European Convention of Human Rights, where its Article 10 on freedom of expression provides that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. On this regard, the European Court of Human Rights has confirmed and stressed on several occasions that Article 10 is applicable not only to information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb. And such are the demands of pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness, without which there is no democratic society. So, freedom of expression, according to the Convention, can be subject to exceptions. However, this must be construed strictly, and the need for any restriction must be established convincingly. When it comes to journalists in particular, Tarlak and other speakers before me have amply reported on the case law of the European Court of Human Rights and the hard language, for example, that is used in Dink versus Starkey to oblige states to establish an effective mechanism for the protection in order to create a favorable environment for participation in public debate of all those concerned. So I will not go through the details again. Enough to say that in its case law, the court has laid down relevant principles to be observed by member states when restricting the freedom of expression of journalists. And many of these principles were included and further elaborated in standard setting instruments of the Council of Europe and agreed upon by its member states. So in particular, I redraw your attention on Committee of Ministers recommendation from 2016 on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists and other media actors, which was presented before by Tarlak. I cannot illustrate its key features with the same level of accuracy, so I'll simply say that it is a landmark setting document which has served as inspiration for several other documents and instruments in this domain. Now, to make this guidance provided in the recommendation even more pragmatic, soon after the adoption of the recommendation, the Council of Europe has produced an implementation guide. The implementation guide provides concrete suggestions to the member states for the implementation of the recommendation. It includes a selection of valuable practices developed in member states, references to the relevant case law of the European Court of Human Rights, and other sources that can inform both law and policy making. It provides clear indicators and even a self-assessment tool. It's interesting to be aware that there is also a reader-friendly version which is available of the implementation guide online. I will actually prepare an email with all the relevant documents that I would like maybe to ask the organizers to distribute to those who may be interested in having a relevant listing from Council of Europe tools. Also, recently, 1 week ago, the Council of Europe has adopted a recommendation. This also was mentioned. It calls on the 46 member states to create a favorable environment for quality journalism in the digital age. The recommendation contains a set of legal, administrative, and practical guidelines aimed at ensuring the sustainable funding for quality media, building trust in journalism, and promoting media literacy. These key documents are provided to help the member states to ensure that journalists can fulfill their role as public watchdogs and safeguard their freedom of expression both offline and online. Now, you may agree with me that between the case law of the court, the standard setting instruments, and I only mentioned a few, a number of cooperation projects that are run every year by the Council of Europe, we could expect to have concretely upgraded the protection and safety of journalists all over Europe. And well, this is not forcibly the case. We have seen great developments. We have somehow also provided inspiration, or as someone said before me, even set an example. But still, it is clear that we are also far from being done. Now, when we look at the Council of Europe platform for the protection of journalists and the safety of journalists, it was mentioned before. The platform enables the reporting on serious threats to the safety of journalists all over Europe in order to reinforce not only the Council of Europe's response, but also the member states' accountability. So when we look at that, it does provide a clear scenario which helps us in assessing where are we standing today in making progresses. And only in the past year, the platform registered nearly 300 alerts in 35 different countries. A record number of alerts concern physical attacks, harassment, intimidation, a surge in online abuse and threats against journalists, even fooled by politicians and often presenting a gender connotation. In all this, a culture of impunity remains widespread. Now, the old trends seem to be confirmed while the new phenomena are on the rise. Again, here your draft outline rightly notes how violence against journalists and other media actors, you say, is a moving target, constantly changing in terms of strategies, modalities, and states' responses. And well, this is correct. Let's just think about the most recent years. We went from strengthening safeguards against patterns of intrusive surveillance, arbitrary arrest and detention on bogus charges of terrorism, to regulating media in times of health crisis during the pandemic. We are then facing the urge to, for example, effectively push back strategic lawsuits against public participation, fight gendered attacks on journalists, prevent disinformation, and now, since only a very few weeks, possibly surely the most painful of tasks, we are reshifting the focus on the role of the media in conflict situations and wars. Emerging trends do not replace the old ones, they rather go hand in hand. So what is necessary? A lot is necessary, but I will first refer to the Conference of Ministers responsible for Media and Information Society that met last year in June 2021, and to their preliminary proposals for next actions in this field. They adopted inter alia resolution on the safety of journalists, and it's really important. Member states agreed that they must remain committed to make the protection of journalists a political priority. In connection to these, European and international plans of action need to build on strong foundations, and this can only be found in national laws and policies. And that's why it was clear for the ministers that participated in the conference that dedicated national action plans on the safety of journalists should be devised. Then, as attacks on journalists take many forms, we must be able to identify the worrisome trends and provide guidance, of course, also based on a forward-looking vision. However, and on this, I will tell you more. This year, we are actually starting the work to reinforce the Council of Europe's standard-setting arsenal, and we'll be focusing on fighting strategic lawsuits against public participation. We will be drafting recommendations on countering the spread of mis and disinformation and increasing media resilience. But on all occasions, we should be aware that, as it is often the case, several are the crucial standards that are available already, but as many speakers pointed out before me, there's an implementation gap. So an effective implementation is what we should strive for. Finally, the safety of journalists, I am persuaded it shall no more be considered an issue for the journalists alone. As everyone is affected, it should rather be everyone's concern. And this requires, of course, more effort as when it comes to awareness raising on the gravity and the scale of the problem. And this is something that the Council of Europe will actually try to achieve, amongst other goals, through a comprehensive Europe-wide campaign that most likely will start at the end of this year or early next year. So I hope I said enough. I would be happy to reply to your question. There's so much to say on this topic, and I look forward to addressing your questions or concerns if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. You know, we've had a problem with your video. We heard you perfectly, but we couldn't see you. I think that has been happening in Zoom meetings lately, that the video, when it's turned off, can't be turned on again. I wanted to highlight two things you mentioned. One of them, because Renata also mentioned it, which is the importance of political will. I also, again, add here my Latin American experience, which basically confirms the importance of the presence of that commitment by political actors to combat this problem. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is the importance of national laws. We tend to focus, when we focus on international human rights standards, these standards as well highlight this importance. And I thought that was very interesting and important to underscore. I'm not sure if either Renata, Tarla, or Sarah wants to make a brief closing comment. If you do, please raise your hand or let me know. Otherwise, thank you all very much for joining us today. I hope it was informative for all of us who participated and for all of us, of all who were seeing us through YouTube. So thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, Ramiro. Bye-bye.
Bye, Renata.